Croissant. This is James, aka JP Harker, coming to you with another video. This is sort of a book versus film. It's not quite that because it's not a film based on a book, but it's a book about what's in the film. So I thought I'd have a look at it. The film is 1964 classic Zulu, which it's a little unfair that Michael Caine's is the name above the title, because really it's Stanley Baker's film that has Michael Caine in it. But both of them brilliant in it. Absolute classic. If you haven't watched it, watch it. Wonderful. What I'm comparing it to is Like Wolves on the Fold, The Defence of Rorke's Drift by Lieutenant Colonel Mike Snook. And he is himself a veteran of the 24th Regiment of Foot, or as it is now. So that's an interesting little thing. He has a lot of insight into the regiment's history. Now, Like Wolves on the Fold, it covers the Battle of Rorke's Drift. Now as usual, I try not to go too much into detail of here's the historical context, because that's a video in and of itself. So I won't go into the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 and all of the various colonial causes and Ketsuweo and the disbanding of the impis and all of that. I'll keep it short. British Empire is at war with the Zulu nation. The Zulu nation has inflicted a crippling defeat on the lead column at Isandlwana the same morning of this, January 22nd, 1879. And following that massive defeat, they're advancing towards a small mission station where just one company of the 24th Foot have been stationed, and that station is Rorke's Drift. We're looking at approximately 4,000 Zulus fighting a little over 100 British soldiers. And it's generally considered one of those huge underdog battles. And I will go into why in a minute. Now, the film Zulu, it does better than a lot of films of its time would have done, because it does show a bit of the perspective of Ketsuweo and the Zulus. They're not a faceless horde. You do see a little bit of his side of things. You do see that they are a warrior breed and they deserve respect. They're not just there to be cannon fodder. But it does miss out a few key points, and this book very nicely highlights those. Now, obviously because 11 Victoria Crosses were won at this and they made a film out of it, spoiler alert, the British won that battle. And the way it's portrayed in the film is we have these multiple waves of the Zulu attacking a perimeter of mealie bags. They're attack and repelled, eventually the defenders are forced to fall back to the buildings, the hospital is fired, and a final redoubt is built, and the Zulu lose so many people they lose all taste for it and they are forced to withdraw. And that's sort of what happened. But here's a little bit about what actually happened. For a start, while I love the song at the end, there's no sing-off at the end. There's no chorus of men of Hardlech and the Zulu doing their chanting. And there are lots of little things like Colour Sergeant Vaughan was a man in his early 20s, and Gonville Promhead, beautifully played by Michael Caine as this ultimately tough but seemingly slightly foppish upper-class officer. He was actually a regimental boxing and wrestling champion and had been in the army for longer than John Shard had, so that was not really accurate. Another minor thing is, during this time it was compulsory for officers to wear moustaches, but it's 1960s fashion, everybody there is clean-shaven, Stanley Baker and Michael Caine. But little details like that, they are forgivable. You know, it's Hollywood, it's not a documentary, things like that, it's not that vital. I would say there are two things that this book highlights, and this book is filled with historical detail. It's filled with the detail of all the VC winners, it's filled with the details of what led up to this, about Chelmsford and the politics that led up to the Anglo-Zulu War. So, fascinating book. But in the context of comparing it to the film, I'd say there are two major differences. One is the character of Private Hook. And this became a little controversial when the film was released. In the film, Henry Hook is a bit of a rogue who has a sort of redemption arc. He's malingering in the hospital, and he's gambling, and he doesn't care what's happening. And he's sort of the voice of an anti-war, anti-authority audience member. And he then shows his heroism by going back for someone when he could have escaped from the hospital unharmed. Now, in real life, Henry Hook was a very pious man, very devout man, a very dutiful man, and had taken command in the hospital, and his family, his descendants, had gone to see the film of Zulu, and they sent hate mail to the actor and to the studio saying, "How dare you defame our ancestors so much?" And so the film's excuse is, well, we needed somebody to have this arc. We wanted a private soldier in this position, so we sort of invented the character in that way. To what extent they can justify that, I don't know. Because it's one thing to tweak a character slightly, or to slightly enhance a rivalry, because there would have been some rivalry between Bromhead and Chard. But it's considered, for the most part, they worked well together. They understood that they needed to compromise, and things like that. Upping the tension a little bit in a film, I can understand. Slight adjustments to a character, I can understand. Completely changing the nature of who somebody is, I don't know if you can really justify that in the name of drama. You know, invent somebody if you have to do that. That's the first major difference. The second major difference, again, it flirts with being unforgivable, but I can understand why they did it for the sake of spectacle. And that is, the battle didn't really happen as a case of lots of assegai-wielding Zulu charged in and fell back, and charged in and fell back, and charged in, and basically sort of flew into the teeth of the British guns in the hopes of overwhelming them, because once we're up close, we'll have the advantage. That looks great and cinematic. That's not what really happened. Ever since, long before 1879, the Zulus had access to firearms. They've been trading with the Portuguese. They've been raiding the Dutch colonies, the Transvaal. They've been collecting weapons. They're not as good as the Martini Henry, which is being used by the British. But they have rifles. They have flintlock muskets. And a lot of this was close-range firefights. From what the author here says, about 1 in 5 of the Zulus would have had a firearm. And you think that's not much, but when you think there's 4,000 of them, that's still an awful lot of guns to face the 100 guns of the British. And the big difference was, one, they weren't as efficient as the breech-loading Martini Henry, but they also lacked the firing discipline of the British Army. And partly they didn't have the accuracy and the reloading speed, but also the British Army were trained to use these, and the British Army was one of the best trained armies in the world. It was oddly one of the smaller armies in the world, but it was known as fantastically trained in use of rifles and in use of bayonets. So the idea of the British were shooting, but once it came up close the Zulus had the edge, is only a half-truth. The British were better at shooting, and the Zulus were better up close. But both of them also had the other's advantage. The British were very well trained in close combat with bayonet fighting, and the Zulus had a lot of guns and a fair bit of practice using them. So that is a huge difference between reality and film. And like I say, I don't know if you can call it an unforgivable oversight in the name of cinema. But it was something that I found really interesting when I was reading this book, because it completely changed my mindset on how this happened. And as I say, this is filled with other historical goodies, and I'll strongly recommend it, but if you're a fan of this wonderful film, and I still am, I would recommend picking up, like Wolves on the Fold, Lieutenant Colonel Mike Snook, because it gives such a new perspective on it. It hasn't ruined the film for me. But those two things, and you might find more things, have made such a difference in my understanding of the conflict. So, yes, I've gone on a bit. I could go on quite a bit more, because I've read other books on this quite recently. But I'm going to leave it at that in the context of this video. So I'm going to hold these up. I'm going to say, if you like Zulu, which you should, if you haven't seen it, watch it. I can recommend reading this to give it some context. I think you will be pleasantly entertained by the stories and that you'll enjoy the detail. So I shall leave it at that. This is James, aka JP Harker. Will Valley.